dozens of Russian targets were detected and struck from the air within just a few hours, including infantry groups, vehicles, artillery positions, and supply trucks. This level of damage did not come from long-range missiles or large-scale airstrikes, but from small FPV drones that fly low, cost little, and operate without pause day and night. Across several frontline sectors, the battlefield is changing in a way earlier combat videos rarely explain. Ukraine is increasingly shaping the space itself, turning roads, tree lines, and open ground into monitored zones where movement is exposed the moment it begins. When every approach can be watched from above, danger appears before contact with the enemy. Russian infantry risks being hit while advancing. Artillery faces detection before it can relocate. Supply vehicles are destroyed before reaching forward units. The impact goes beyond immediate losses, because it directly threatens the rhythm and coordination of Russian operations across the front. What makes this shift especially dangerous is how quietly it unfolds. FPV drones do not announce an offensive or redraw maps overnight. Instead, they narrow options, slow decisions, and punish routine behavior until pressure builds across multiple sectors at once. This analysis explains why FPV drones are stripping Russia of operational initiative. It also raises a harder question. If control of movement has become the real battlefield, can adaptation arrive in time, or is this the cost of fighting a war where the rules have already changed? FPV ambushes are making Russian infantry unsafe from the moment movement begins, because familiar routes have turned into monitored kill zones rather than paths to the line. Ukrainian FPV teams are positioned along roads and approach lanes that Russian units rely on, and this placement changes the opening phase of every advance. What once felt routine now triggers exposure, because entry into these corridors is watched and timed rather than discovered by chance. Once infantry steps onto these routes, visibility from above compresses reaction time to seconds. Footage shows soldiers moving in the open without smoke or cover, and the moment they cross into a watched space, tracking begins. The drone does not rush. It follows. This is where safety collapses at the starting line. Infantry normally counts on the first minutes of movement to organize spacing, adjust direction, and read terrain. FPV surveillance denies that window. Soldiers are identified before formations settle, which means early losses happen before contact with Ukrainian ground forces. The engagement starts in the air, not at the trench. The pattern repeats across days. These are not lucky encounters or isolated catches. Routes are tested, watched, and revisited. When the same path produces hits again and again, behavior changes on the ground. Units slow down. They hesitate at intersections. They bunch up while deciding where to go next. Each pause creates new exposure. FPV ambushes also reshape how infantry reacts under pressure. When a drone appears ahead or to the side, instinct pushes soldiers to scatter or sprint for nearby cover. Open ground offers little protection, and nearby trees or small dips rarely break overhead view. Movement meant to escape detection often confirms it. The drone adjusts altitude and angle, keeping the target framed until the strike window opens. What follows is not only loss of personnel, but disruption of command control. Leaders trying to guide squads forward are forced to make decisions under immediate threat. Radio traffic increases, gestures replace clear commands, and spacing collapses as soldiers cluster around perceived cover. None of these actions are planned. They are reactions, and reactions favor the side that already controls observation. Another consequence appears in timing. Infantry advances depend on synchronization with artillery, engineers, and support elements. FPV pressure breaks that rhythm early. When squads are hit or pinned before reaching their intended positions, supporting fire arrives late or not at all. The failure happens upstream, before the main line is even approached. This dynamic also explains why losses feel constant rather than dramatic. FPV ambushes do not produce a single decisive moment. They create a steady drain that erodes confidence with each attempt. Soldiers learn that even careful movement carries risk, and that lesson spreads quickly through units. Over time, hesitation replaces momentum. The result is a battlefield where the first meters are as dangerous as the last. Infantry no longer tests defenses at the edge of contact. It tests them the instant it moves. Control of the sky compresses the fight forward, shifting danger to the starting point rather than the objective. If movement itself has become the trigger for engagement, the central question becomes unavoidable. Can infantry still maneuver safely when the sky is watched without pause? Or has the opening step of every advance already become the most dangerous part of the battle? The growing use of motorcycles and ATVs shows how speed has replaced protection for Russian infantry, yet this advantage is now collapsing under constant FPV pressure. Light vehicles are chosen to cross exposed ground quickly, reduce time in danger zones, and avoid predictable armored routes. On paper, this trade favors momentum over armor. On the battlefield, it creates a new vulnerability that drones are designed to exploit. When motorcycles enter watched terrain, speed does not prevent detection. FPV drones track movement patterns rather than vehicles alone, and fast motion often stands out more clearly against static ground. Riders accelerate to escape, but the drone adjusts altitude and angle instead of chasing blindly. The engagement becomes a pursuit where the vehicle can turn, but the drone can wait and reposition. Time works against the rider, not the drone. As pressure builds, the next decision usually makes things worse. Soldiers often abandon the vehicle once the drone closes in, believing that separation will break the track. That choice trades speed for exposure. A moving rider on open ground becomes two slower targets on foot, each easier to follow from above. The vehicle stops being an escape tool and turns into a marker that confirms where the unit attempted to pass. Running on foot introduces new problems. Breath shortens. Direction changes become sharp and reactive. Cover options narrow to shallow dips, thin tree lines, or small structures that rarely block overhead view. The drone does not need to rush. It observes how the target moves, which side hesitates, and where the path tightens. Control stays with the operator, not the infantry. This pattern repeats across multiple engagements and days, which reveals why speed alone fails. Fast movement only matters when it reduces exposure time. Under aerial control, exposure begins at detection, not at contact. Once spotted, faster motion does not erase the track. It often sharpens it. The drone sees acceleration as intent, not escape. The reliance on light vehicles also changes unit behavior in harmful ways. Riders cluster to reduce isolation, which increases signature and reduces spacing. They follow narrow paths that seem safer for bikes, but funnel movement into predictable lines. When one vehicle is hit or forced to stop, others slow or divert nearby. Confusion spreads faster than coordination. Orders shift mid-movement. Signals overlap. Some units push forward despite warning signs, while others halt too early. Both outcomes favor the observer in the sky. Another effect appears in timing. Motorcycles are meant to move ahead of heavier elements, secure ground, and guide follow-on forces. When these units are delayed or disrupted, support arrives out of sync. Fire support waits for confirmation that never comes. Engineers hesitate without clear lanes. Momentum fades before the main effort begins. What makes this collapse of speed dangerous is its psychological impact. Routes that once felt manageable now feel trapped. Even successful crossings carry the memory of near misses, which slows the next attempt. The battlefield lesson is clear. Light vehicles remove armor but do not remove visibility. They shorten exposure only until detection occurs. After that moment, speed becomes noise, not safety. If movement can be seen and followed regardless of pace, infantry faces a hard choice. when speed and camouflage both lose value under constant observation? What option remains for maneuver on a battlefield where the sky never looks away? FPV strikes are no longer focused on destroying targets outright, because disabling function has become enough to break an operation. Ukrainian drone teams increasingly aim at weak points on tanks, field positions, and fortified spaces, which shifts the goal from total destruction to mission failure. When a vehicle or position can no longer fight, move, or support others, its role on the battlefield ends even if the structure remains standing. This approach changes how armored threats are handled. Tanks that remain hidden or partially covered are still vulnerable once their movement patterns are mapped. FPV drones approach from angles that armor was not designed to defend against, often staying low and out of sight until the final seconds. The strike does not need to burn through the hull. Damage to exposed components, external gear, or crew access points is enough to force withdrawal or abandonment. The tank survives on paper, but its task does not. The same logic applies to field fortifications. Dugouts, basements, and improvised shelters are built to protect against artillery and direct fire, not against a device that can enter from above or through narrow openings. FPV operators study how soldiers enter and exit these spaces, then wait for moments when protection is weakest. A strike at that point does not collapse the structure. It removes its purpose as a safe position. What matters here is timing rather than raw force. FPV attacks are launched when targets settle into routine behavior. Crews relax after movement. Infantry gathers inside cover believed to be secure. Equipment is staged nearby. These moments create predictable patterns that drones exploit. The strike arrives when attention drops, not when defenses are fully alert. This method reshapes how pressure spreads across a sector. A disabled tank creates hesitation in nearby units that expected armored support. A compromised dugout forces infantry to relocate under observation. Each localized failure pushes risk onto adjacent positions. The battlefield becomes a chain of small breakdowns rather than a single dramatic collapse. Another shift appears in how resources are used. Destroying a target completely requires time, precision, and often multiple attempts. Disabling it takes less. One well-placed FPV can remove a firing position, block a route, or deny shelter. That efficiency allows operators to effect more points across the line in the same period. The impact multiplies without increasing effort. This also changes how Russian units respond after a hit. Repair under observation is difficult. Recovery teams draw attention. Replacement equipment must move through the same watched areas that caused the loss. Each response carries its own risk. Over time, the cost of restoring function outweighs the value of holding the position. A tank that no longer advances leaves infantry exposed. A dugout that no longer shelters forces movement at the worst time. The strike echoes forward into later phases of the fight. As this pattern continues, defensive planning becomes harder. Armor cannot rely on concealment alone. Fortifications cannot promise safety. Every position must assume it can be reached. That assumption reshapes behavior long before contact with enemy troops. The battlefield lesson is clear. Victory does not require wiping targets off the map. It requires making them unable to function when needed most. If missions fail without full destruction, the question shifts from survival to usefulness. When tanks and shelters can no longer perform their role, what remains for forces trying to hold ground under constant watch from above? Night has lost its role as a shield, because thermal-equipped FPV now turn darkness into a continuous pressure zone rather than a pause in fighting. Ukrainian drones operating after sunset use heat contrast to detect movement that would once have blended into shadow. A body lying still in grass still produces a signature. Slow steps still leave a trace. The battlefield no longer resets when the light fades. Once darkness falls, behavior that once felt safer becomes visible in a different way. Soldiers choose night to move supplies, rotate positions, or adjust spacing with less fear of observation. Thermal sensors reverse that logic. Warm engines, bodies, and recently handled equipment stand out against cooling ground. Detection happens without sound or warning, which removes the cues troops rely on to judge risk. This changes how time is used on the front. Night was meant to recover from the strain of the day. Units planned rest, reorganization, and preparation under cover of darkness. With FPV watching, those hours shrink. Movement must be delayed or broken into fragments. Tasks that require coordination become risky. Each action is weighed against the chance of being seen before it is completed. The effect spreads beyond individual targets. When one soldier is detected at night, nearby positions freeze. Others stop moving, unsure if the drone sees more than it reveals. Silence replaces communication. That hesitation slows the entire line. The sky dictates tempo, not the clock. Thermal detection also changes the meaning of concealment. Grass, bushes, and shallow cover block sight, but not heat. A soldier pressed into vegetation still glows against cooler surroundings. Even slow crawling leaves a pattern. This forces reliance on deeper structures, which concentrate people and raise stakes if those locations are compromised. Night movement meant to reduce exposure ends up creating clusters that are easier to monitor. Another pressure appears in decision-making. Leaders must choose whether to accept risk now or delay until conditions improve. With night offering no relief, delay often means exposure later under the same watch. That trap erodes confidence in planning. Choices feel reactive rather than deliberate. Control slips toward whoever observes continuously. The absence of safe hours also affects morale. Soldiers measure endurance not only by fire received, but by the chance to breathe between threats. When that chance disappears, stress accumulates faster than units can absorb it. Night FPV operations also shape support actions. Resupply that once moved after dark now faces the same exposure as daylight runs. Vehicles idle longer to avoid detection, which delays delivery. Foot movement replaces engines, which slows pace and increases physical strain. Each workaround carries its own risk, and none restore the lost advantage of darkness. This reality forces a hard question for infantry on the ground. If darkness no longer offers concealment or rest, and if every hour carries similar risk, how does endurance hold over days and weeks? When the sky never looks away, what happens to morale, cohesion, and the will to keep moving under constant thermal eyes? Strikes on logistics and artillery are pushing FPV effects beyond the tactical layer, because pressure now reaches deep behind the front line and disrupts how the fight is sustained. Ukrainian drones are not limited to the edge of contact. They observe routes, yards, and staging areas where supplies pause and guns reposition. When these nodes are hit, the impact travels forward, even if the blast occurs far from infantry. Supply movement depends on timing and predictability. Trucks leave at known hours, follow familiar paths, and stop at points chosen for access and concealment. FPV surveillance turns those habits into exposure. Once a vehicle is tracked, the strike does not need to be immediate. The drone waits until the truck commits to a narrow section or slows near cover. A single loss forces rerouting, which delays follow-on loads and creates gaps that ripple across units expecting resupply. The effect compounds as routes grow uncertain. Drivers hesitate at intersections. Convoys split to reduce risk, which stretches schedules and increases time on the road. Each adjustment invites further observation. The rear area begins to feel like an extension of the front, not a safe zone. Supplies arrive late or not at all, and frontline units feel the absence long before they understand the cause. Artillery suffers a similar pressure. Guns rely on mobility and concealment to survive. FPV tracking narrows both. When a firing position is identified, relocation becomes risky because the same eyes watch the departure. Crews face a choice between staying put under threat or moving through observed ground. Neither option restores freedom of action. Fire missions shorten. Rates drop. Support windows close earlier than planned. As artillery presence thins, infantry loses confidence in timely cover. Assault elements pause without assurance that suppressive fire will arrive when needed. Defensive units conserve ammunition, unsure when the next delivery will come. The battlefield tone shifts from aggression to caution. Momentum fades without a dramatic clash. The system slows itself. Recovery adds another layer of strain. A damaged truck draws attention to repair teams. A disabled gun requires towing and escort. These actions create fresh movement that drones can follow. Each attempt to fix a problem risks creating the next one. Over time, the cost of restoration outweighs the benefit of holding certain positions. This pressure reveals why FPV effects feel strategic rather than isolated. The drones do not need to destroy everything. They need to disrupt enough points that coordination breaks. When logistics falter and artillery hesitates, the front line changes shape without a single breakthrough. The map may look stable, but the ability to act within it erodes. Command decisions reflect this shift. Leaders allocate more resources to protection and diversion, which leaves fewer assets for offense. Planning cycles shorten as uncertainty grows. Another consequence appears in morale. Soldiers at the front sense when support is unreliable. When that confidence weakens, discipline holds, but initiative drops. Units follow instructions carefully, yet avoid risks that once seemed manageable. The fight becomes defensive in spirit, even during planned advances. All of this shows how FPV has crossed a threshold. The tool no longer acts at the edge of contact alone. It reaches into the processes that keep combat going. By thinning logistics and constraining artillery, drones influence outcomes over days and weeks rather than minutes. The central choice now sharpens. Should effort focus on breaking infantry at the line, or on starving that line of movement, fire, and supply until action collapses on its own? When pressure can be applied deep and continuously, which path shapes the battlefield more decisively in this phase of the war? Across the battlefield, FPV strikes are no longer just moments of destruction. They are reshaping how war is fought, minute by minute, route by route, decision by decision. What began as isolated drone hits has grown into a system that controls movement, disrupts supply, and pressures artillery far from the front line. When roads are watched, night offers no cover, and rear areas are no longer safe, the fight changes its rhythm. Infantry feels the effect first because movement itself becomes dangerous. Armored support cannot arrive on time. Artillery hesitates under constant tracking. Logistics slow under threat. None of these effects require a breakthrough. The front may look stable on a map, yet the ability to act within that space keeps shrinking. This is why the FPV story matters beyond individual strikes. It shows how control, not destruction, can decide the pace of war. By narrowing options rather than eliminating forces outright, drones apply pressure that spreads across days and weeks. The larger question now sits ahead. How far can this model expand? And how fast can countermeasures catch up? Adaptation is possible, but time matters. If control of movement hardens into a permanent structure, the cost of delay could rise quickly. If this analysis helped clarify what is really changing on the battlefield, like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to Military Force for clear, grounded coverage of conflicts shaping the world today.